From the CISO Series, it's cybersecurity headlines.
White House gets tough with new national cyber strategy. CISA says to stop passing the security buck, and News Corp reveals that attackers remained on its network for 2 years. These are some of the stories that my colleagues and I have been bringing to you on this week's cybersecurity headlines. And now we get a chance for some insight, opinion, and definitely some expertise on these stories and more from our guest, Nick Vigier, the CISO at Talend. Nick, thank you so much for being here. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Before we move on, we got to thank our sponsor, Conveyor. Get out of the questionnaire Stone Age. Remember to join us on YouTube Live. To do so, just go to CISOseries.com, hit the events drop down, and look for the cybersecurity headlines week in review image. It's the third one down, so just count it. Just click on it. You can join us, have some fun. We've got about 20 minutes, though, so let's hop to it. White House gets tough with new national cyber strategy. The White House unveiled its long-awaited national cybersecurity strategy yesterday, laying out a holistic approach to improving digital security across the country. The plan is built around 5 basic pillars that involve minimum cybersecurity requirements for critical infrastructure, offensive cyber actions against hackers and nation-states, shifting liability onto software manufacturers, diversifying and expanding the cyber workforce, and continuing to build international partnerships. So, Nick, two of our resident experts, Steve Zalewski, co-host of Defense in Depth, and Andy Ellis, co-host of the CISO Series podcast, expressed some concerns around software liability reform and the federal cyber insurance backstop, both of which seem to represent a good deal of potential overreach, if nothing else. The Biden-Harris administration has been very visible in their efforts to improve cybersecurity and the cyber industry in the U.S. in general. Do you feel that this strategy is a good fit or a little beyond practical?
I mean, I think the thing with a lot of these is they're aspirational, right? They're directionally, correct, but they're aspirational in nature. So to think that like from today to tomorrow they're magically going to be enforceable and things that are going to hinder business or cause significant legal or financial problems is not something that I'm preoccupied about personally. More or less for me on this strategy, it's trying to broaden the aperture a little bit more, right? I think the previous strategies were a lot more focused on a very narrow subset of reactionary critical infrastructure like oil pipelines and stuff like that, because we just went through colonial pipeline and all those fun times. And now we're broadening the aperture a little bit more on what's critical and how we try to defend as a nation. And the offensive side, I think, is interesting in terms of very explicitly stating that, like, hey, the United States is going to become more active in its pursuit of the criminal activity and the online attacks and things of that nature. Not necessarily hackback, but more, we are going to come after you, and we're going to make, I think what they termed it as they're going to shrink the size of the earth for the attackers. So limit the safe havens and whatnot. So I think there's a lot of different elements in this. The insurance one, I think, is something, that's probably some overreach, right? But I think it's more just kind of like putting a flag in the ground and saying, hey, this is where we want to point the ship. It's just a question of how we're going to get there, if we get there.
Yeah, and the point of this is also that this is to guide, legislative priorities for their executive order. So like there is a lot of process that needs to go from like these ideals to anything that's going to impact industry. But I think, to your point, definitely shows a broadening around, software supply chains and offensive measures that we've seen other national police forces increasingly using to pretty significant effect too.
Yeah, the all the botnet takedowns, malware takedowns, and the ransomware group takedowns that have been happening. I mean, the coordination level has been pretty impressive. Now these are like large systemic things, but I think the other side of it, of starting to classify ransomware as a national security threat and whatnot, we see hospitals getting targeted and things of that nature. I think really starting to say, this is the significance of the problem is a really important first step to say we want to take this seriously. And I think, to your point, we want to see legislative action moving in this direction. But I think we all know that takes a lot of time and effort in order to be able to get there.
All right. Well, we've got kind of a related story up next here. CISA says to stop passing the security buck. At a recent event at Carnegie Mellon University, Jen Easterly called on technology companies to fundamentally shift product design around security. She said frequently tech companies shift the burden of security to consumers, ending up where, quote, we've unwittingly come to accept as normal that such technology is dangerous by design. So, aside from being Jen Easterly's new book title once she gets out of CISA, Dangerous by Design, given that CISOs and security specialists have been struggling for years to keep up with vulnerabilities that seem to exploit networks and software, do you find this call to be, I guess, hit or miss or somewhere in the middle?
I think it's, and I think the community at large was very supportive of this mindset. And I think we've seen the same thing as it relates to consumer goods and electronics with like UL, right?
Mhm.
Um, like you shouldn't have to worry about your hairdryer exploding every time you plug it in. And so they have standards and tests. The tougher thing here is really along the lines of how software is built and what have you, and what might be secure today may not be secure tomorrow. Depending on all these underlying components and everything else. So I think that uh, um, I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of like organizations understanding that um, having secure products and having secure development life cycles and things like that, and having some kind of like minimum set of things that you do in order to keep your software secure and the products that you build secure is a good thing and actually helps your business be more efficient, be more effective, and leads to fewer quality issues and less wasted time down the road, as well as a better customer experience and more secure environment. So I think calling this out is super important. Uh, I think the notion that we could have some kind of standards base. I think there were some attempts to date of having a UL for software to a certain extent, right? Like a nutrition card and whatnot. And SBOM tries to get us in that direction. But I think it's directionally correct. It's a question of how the rubber hits the road.
Next up here, News Corp reveals that attackers remained on its network for 2 years. The media and publishing giant News Corp, owner of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post, among a bevy of others, has revealed that a cyber attack took place in January 2022 was carried out by a nation state actor, which they believe to be a China-linked APT group, which first gained a foothold in the company infrastructure in February 2020. If you look at the calendar, that's about 2 years. This comes on the heels of the passing the security buck story from CISA. Here we see the inherent weakness in vulnerability detection. If an APT can lurk inside a system for 2 years, I guess what does this say about our collective confidence in threat detection?
I mean, APTs in and of themselves are. I mean, that's a whole. If you're solving for APTs, you're in a special class of business, right? And I
Mhm.
will say that journalism does typically fall into that. And the thing that I found really interesting about this story is that it happened in February 2020. What happened right after February 2020? And
Hmm.
where did that virus come from? A really interesting kind of like if you play back how distracted news organizations were in February 2020, it was almost a great foil for having this happen. And so, I mean, listen, if we look at typical APTs and whatnot, you're talking about like a year plus of dwell time usually. I don't think this is an indictment against News Corp. I think this is kind of, I would say, almost typical for a high risk organization. The question, though, I mean, your question around, our ability to detect, they detected it when the attacker finally like tripped up and triggered something, right? And these things happen, and I think it's a matter of organizations understanding that depending on their threat model, they need to undertake certain types of activities that might allow them to detect these types of behaviors and attackers. It's just a question of like having the time and budgeting and effort in order to be able to do so.
All right, well, next up here, we've got more bad news for LastPass. It's a little bit of a setup here, but I think interesting. We definitely need to get into it. LastPass said Monday that the same attacker that stole partially encrypted login data back in August hacked into an employee's home computer shortly thereafter. The threat actor was able to exploit a vulnerability in a third-party media software package. Some people are saying it's Plex. I haven't seen confirmation of that, on a senior DevOps engineer's computer to load a keylogger and steal their credentials. They then used the stolen credentials to break into the corporate vault, which contained encryption keys for customer vault backups stored in Amazon S3 buckets. The engineer was one of only 4 LastPass employees with access to the corporate vault, making me think they got that information also from the August hack. Amazon notified LastPass of the incident after identifying the threat actor trying to use cloud identity and access management roles to perform unauthorized activity. So, all that being said, Nick, it seems every week there's a story that forces me to pull down the metaphorical glasses here and look over them with perhaps some judgment here. Many bad things to choose from in this story. I guess what stands out to you as the most significant?
The thing that, I mean, all of this is awful.
That's the
when I look at when I read the story, right? I think the thing that sticks out to me is only 4 LastPass employees had access. When you have that type of sensitive system, and it's sensitive because only 4 people have access to it, that's where you start taking into account your threat model and saying, how do I make sure that not only is it only accessible to those 4 people, but maybe it's only accessible from 4 known devices that are more secure, that are never used in any other way. This machine was being used for this guy's home video streaming.
Yeah.
This is not, a high security system that only 4 people should have access to at that point. So, if I was boiling away all of that, it's really, there were a lot of failures in here, and LastPass is in the unfortunate situation where they can't get themselves out of the news cycle, which is a really awful place to be when you're doing incident response and recovery. Like the Home Depot breach went really, really quickly, right? One letter, etc. Target, it's like every week there was another, like, oh, it's 50 million more people and 50 million more people. This is similar to Target. This is like, it just keeps coming back in the news and reminding you of why people are moving away from this. It's going to be a really hard recovery, but that's what sticks out to me. If you have a system that only 4 people at your entire company are supposed to have access to, because it is the biggest crown jewel you have, find better ways of securing access to it.
Yeah, I want the Mission Impossible room with the pressure sensitive floor when it's that. I don't want it on your Plex Drobo that you have in your closet. That.
Yeah.
That is bizarre. All right, before we move on to our next story, we have to spend a few moments with our sponsor, Conveyor. Just because your security questionnaire is from the Stone Age doesn't mean you have to answer it with cave-era tools. At Conveyor, they implement GPT-3 into their first-of-its-kind questionnaire eliminator, so teams of all sizes can blast through questionnaires faster than you can say prehistoric. Go beyond rewriting mediocre matches to getting your questionnaire autofilled with the exact answers customers need. Join the top SaaS companies in the GPT-3 powered future by using Conveyor. Learn more at conveyor.com. Next up here, GitHub expands its secret scanning. Back in December, GitHub introduced a beta for a free secret scanning feature on public repositories. Now, GitHub has announced the service is publicly available. This looks for API keys, passwords, tokens, and other confidential information left in code. As part of this, GitHub will also notify its service partners if it detects their secret is left in someone else's public repository, letting them revoke tokens and notify impacted customers. Nick, technological innovations, this seems on the surface to be a good thing. I can't help but think there's also perhaps a way for this to be exploited by bad actors, sometimes, in some way that we're maybe not thinking of right now. Do you have any reservations about a service like this that is, kind of looking for the most sensitive information?
This is being acted on public repositories, so the actors are already doing it, right? I think this is a great awareness tool. I think that part of what this brings into, especially for younger developers or developers that might not be as experienced that have open repositories, is it might be a really great way to help educate on the right way to integrate secrets into your code, as opposed to allowing it to persist. So I think that there's really, there's not just the element around better security hygiene for API keys and secrets and things like that, but I think there's actually a teachable moment for developers to leverage this So I don't really see like a downside to this, to be perfectly honest. I think this is a really great service, and I applaud the GitHub team for putting this out there, and for attacking it from both sides, right? So you might publish a key, and hey, you know what? It's actually going to get revoked preemptively, most likely by the service provider. But here's also the information you need to make sure that you don't do that again in the future.
Well, and especially because there are, I mean, it's notorious that, like, especially for anything, crypto wallet related, but any kind of keys and stuff like that, these things are being proactively scanned by malicious actors so that when it goes live, you have almost no time to react. So yeah, the fact that it can be preventative, I think, and just putting it out there for, anybody just click the box on to do that. I do agree opt-in is the way to go with that, but I think definitely great for the community at large. Next up here, how to integrate Gen Z into a security program. CSO Online's Meryl Vernon recently looked at how organizations can better work to attract a younger generation into IT and cybersecurity. Vernon's report showed that Gen Z employees can be eager to learn new skills, but they also want to move forward quickly to new challenges. They also greatly prefer electronic communication, even with people within speaking distance, just across the table from them. Nick, it's natural for any younger generation to be far more comfortable with technology that they've maybe grown up with, but still many companies continue to manage old school, even as they are trying to build more conducive communities. I'm thinking of like the Omaha philosophy with Salesforce. These things can be quickly pushed aside when economies turn. We're already seeing that with Salesforce, and things get tighter. I'm curious, what are your thoughts about how to attract, onboard, and retain engaged younger professionals, Gen Z or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, well, like you said, there's kind of this like contraction slash reversion going on right now with regards to work styles and what have you. I think we've swung the pendulum really far in one direction, and I think now it's got to come back down to the middle a little bit. And I think it's going to be a matter of like how we engage Gen Z in that sense. As someone who doesn't understand how TikTok works or even Instagram, I'm definitely not the group of people that are like talking to each other on their device across the table from each other. But I think that there's a lot of opportunity to engage in that in collaboration, to identify new collaboration tools that might be helpful. I think the biggest danger is to make sure that while there's a desire to act in a certain way, there's still things that have to happen in a different way. And so it's not a matter of like full accommodation, but it's a matter of like how you adapt, and you don't just keep doing things the old way. So for me, it's really about making sure that we're not always doing things, not always collaborating in exactly the same way, always having an eye towards the future opportunities for changing communication pathways, and also like the opportunities for innovation along with that, right? Which I think draws people in to contribute, which then adds to a little bit more of that, younger generation wanting to participate.
Yeah, definitely. And for our listeners, if you haven't checked out the piece, we'll have it linked in the show notes. But there is some really interesting things about taking what we already know kind of resonates with people, whether it's, being aligned with a company's mission or, preferring electronic communication, and kind of finding ways to lean into what you are already doing so that creates like a positive feedback loop. So again, it's not that you're breaking the things that you need to do, Nick, to your point, but it's again keeping this generation engaged, and especially we keep hearing about the cyber skills shortage and all that kind of stuff. So keep not just bringing people into the industry, but keeping them in there as well, for sure. All right, and our last story here, Canadian book giant says employee data was stolen during a ransomware attack. The Canadian bookseller Indigo denied that any customer data was stolen last month during a ransomware attack that took down its website. However, it now says that employee data was involved in the attack. The Toronto-based company did not respond to requests for comment about how many people were impacted. It has more than 8,000 current employees at about 160 stores across Canada, and the data exposed includes financial information like bank accounts and direct deposit information. So Nick, it's one thing to have, your email address put out there, rich@corporate.com is not like the end of the world. It's quite another to discover that your bank account number is being exposed on the dark web. Seems to have class action lawsuit written all over it. We've seen other companies. I remember Activision just recently had kind of a very similar thing happen, not with financial data, but employee data leaked out there. Is there more that an average employee in retail or any other industry not schooled in IT security can do to protect themselves?
I mean, it's the standard stuff around kind of, I consider kind of my bank account information to be out there, right? It's showing up on checks that get written, things like that. The number of places where it exists is kind of almost infinite, along with all the other breaches that end up happening. So I think it's really along the lines of like, how do you, you leverage the protections that are in the system to begin with. So things like credit card freezes and things along those lines. And the banks are there to be protected as well. So, they've got their own insurance and whatnot. So someone coming in and like emptying your bank account, there's still insurance on that. And so, we're seeing this more and more. There's not a ton that, apart from taking some of those personal measures, making sure that you're managing your own risk appropriately, that it's going to get fixed. I don't know that it's going to be a class action lawsuit, but because it's an employer versus a service provider, but it'll be interesting to see how these things continue to shake out over time. Maybe different banking regulations and stuff like that, and different insurance levels and what have you. But it'll be interesting to see how all this ends up playing out.
Yeah, unfortunately, like the standard almost has to be, but like you said, to assume that that information is at least available, if not being actively used, and kind of to use an overused term, micro segment, like kind of your like where this can hurt you, right? So it's like,
Yeah,
okay, someone might be able to do one charge, but then I can freeze everything. I can shut down, new credit applications, that kind of stuff. So, it kind of just the sign of the times, right?
absolutely.
All right. Well, before we get out of here, Nick, was there any story that was a thumbs up or an eye roller for you? Something you reacted strongly to in today's rundown?
I mean, I like the cyber strategy side, the national cyber strategy side of things. Like, I think that the more my hope is that this actually ends up driving towards kind of like unified privacy governance and things like that, so that we stop with this game of whack-a-mole. So I'm hopeful that like the more these cyber strategies coalesce, that we're able to actually get into a more aligned state, so that it's less of this like hodgepodge of things. And so that a little bit more of that like knowledge and culture gets spread around the industry as well, around all industries.
Well, thank you so much, Nick Vigier, for taking your time being here with us. Where can people find you on the cyberspace if they're so inclined to follow your work?
Definitely not TikTok. I'm going to say LinkedIn. We'll go to LinkedIn.
All right. Well, we will have that. We have that up on the screen. You can see it in your show notes, Nick. Thanks once again. Truly a pleasure having you on the show.
Yeah.
Thanks also to our sponsor, Conveyor. Get out of the questionnaire Stone Age. A reminder to join us next Friday for the Super Cyber Friday discussion, where our topic will be hacking RSA, an hour of critical thinking about how to get the most from attending RSA or any security conference. We'll also be back with another episode of the Week in Review Show. We cannot wait to run down the week's news. But in the meantime, you can get your daily news fix through cybersecurity headlines. Give us 6 minutes every single day. We'll get you all caught up. You can also subscribe to the show through our newsletter on LinkedIn. You can check out Nick's profile, and then you can sign up for our newsletter. You can read and hear the show right from your inbox. Just go to the CISO Series page on LinkedIn to subscribe. We'll be back next week. Until then, I'm Rich Stroffolino, reminding you to have a super sparkly day.
Cybersecurity headlines are available every weekday. Head to CISOSeries.com for the full stories behind the headlines.